And actually, as we tighten the regulations up and people then start properly asking questions, has that been tested or how is that approved, rather than just accepting somebody's word for it, then the capacity issue really comes into play, because people will need to prove the compliance of their products and systems more than they did in the past. And that's the right thing to do, because we have seen in a number of cases people have had their products included in buildings without proper compliance being checked. And when we check the compliance, as we will do on an ongoing basis now in the correct way, a better way, then there'll be a bigger need for that capacity.
Going to come to you first, Tom. I'd just like to start with sort of clarifying some of the terminology. You know, what do we mean when we say fire resistance testing?
Well, thanks very much for having me. So, fire resistance testing, as you say, it's a term that people don't necessarily understand, and they kind of interchange all different sorts of fire testing and sort of lump it all together. But fire resistance testing is fundamentally destructive testing, where you're replicating the intended use of the product, and that really kind of is formed around building a specimen into some sort of supporting construction in some sort of restraint frame that you're then going to mount onto a furnace to replicate the conditions of something like a wall. And obviously the furnace that it's attached to is temperature controlled to some sort of accepted regime, be that a European or a global regime, and you control time and the temperature during the test. And the sorts of things that you test would be walls, doors, floors, ceilings, construction products generally, and then obviously the normal stuff you'd consider within passive fire protection, like intumescent paint and intumescent seals, and you can also do load-bearing and non-load-bearing elements as well. So unlike a lot of tests where you might be seeing what surface spread of flame might be across a wall covering, this is all about creating the in situ use of a product and then recreating a post flashover fire in a compartment behind it to see how it performs.
Yes, yeah, great. Sort of testing the fire compartment, I guess, and I think most people sort of know it as furnace testing. I think it's sort of a colloquial term. Chris, if I come to you a bit on sort of assessment methods, and I hear sort of lots of different terms here, sort of assessment in lieu of tests, technical assessments, engineering judgment. Could you sort of quickly clear up what all these sorts of terms mean?
Yeah, thanks, George. Hi, everybody. What Tom described in the fire resistance test is almost a statement of fact, i.e. this specimen was built on this day or on these days. It was put on a furnace, as Tom described it. The furnace was started, the test was started. It did this. And I'm being very kind of matter of fact, because really that's all the test is, a report of exactly what happened to that specimen on that day at that time. Now the need the need for assessments has come about because it's not practical to test every variation of that tested specimen for use then in an application on site. So it might be thicker, taller, narrower, it might have different cables running through it, there might be different glass in it, might be a different size of door if it's a door. And the assessments that are done, and I think the accepted terminology nowadays seems to be technical assessments, is using that base test data to look at some changes from what was tested to what somebody would either like to sell or to install, or maybe that's already been installed. And there have been over years various descriptions of them, assessments in lieu of test, which the government likes to call them post-Grenfell, but actually it's not in lieu of a test. We're using a test as the base data, or more than one test, and then extrapolating or interpolating between them. And I think if anybody's offering an assessment that hasn't got base test evidence supporting it of the type Tom described, then you would look on it with a bit of you would question it. There needs to be some base test data there to say, here's what was tested, here's what happens to that type of specimen, that type of construction. Now apply some engineering evaluation, technically based, to say what would happen if you make these changes from it. And there was a definite move post-Grenfell to do away with technical assessments or engineering judgments or assessments in lieu of test, but there is a definite need for them. We cannot, it's not practical, it's not economically viable to test every variation from of specimen, of construction out there, and there's no need for that, because some evaluations are very possible, very easy to do. The question gets more difficult when you start taking the construction further away from what was tested and making it then unrepresentative of what was tested. Then you are into kind of dreamland a little bit and making judgments up, and then it gets a bit concerning.
Yeah, no, thanks there, and hopefully that's cleared up for our listeners, and yeah, sort of a lot of good points there. I want to move on next to talking about sort of the current landscape for testing, and particularly the Moral Day report, Testing for a Safer Future. This sort of highlighted the need for additional capacity as one of the main things. And Tom, is there, how can we achieve that? How can we help solve that?
Well, I think it's interesting, isn't it? I suppose the important thing around that is obviously just the acknowledgement that the Moral Day report fundamentally came out of Dame Judith's Building a Safer Future report, and I think Dame Judith was pretty brutal about the whole testing landscape generally, much like she was quite rightly around the general construction landscape. And I think she, to paraphrase her a little bit, I think she said it was at least as complicated as the entire regulatory system, was her comment around product testing, and in particular labelling and marketing of those products. And I think the acknowledgement within her report was that it makes it difficult really to know whether the right products are being used at all, right? Because the testing elements were so complex. And she identified that up to 2/3 of products that were out in the market were basically unregulated. And she felt there was a real lack of clarity around the purpose of testing, the fitness of current standards, and the fact that there was little to no enforcement around the process. And that wasn't just around the UK market, but obviously we received products from all over Europe and all over the world, and there was a real acknowledgement that was an issue. And I think from there, obviously going into the Moral Day report, which looks at all facets of testing, not just the actual physical standard of the test, but obviously the other elements which are critical around capacity, which is obviously what you talked about. And I think when we look at complexity around capacity, it's very, very simple to just say, well, capacity means we need more furnaces. And the reality is that isn't what, in my opinion, that's not what Moral Day report was saying at all. It wasn't really saying that there's a lack of actual working furnaces. That the issue really was around that the whole system was at complete capacity. So not just the actual test houses themselves, but the ability to set standards, the ability to undertake conformity assessments, and indeed the oversight of the whole industry itself was at a point where it just simply couldn't regulate itself, which obviously threatens quality, and in essence it's seen as a barrier to the reformation that we believe we need in the industry post Grenfell. And I think the urgency around testing initially was obviously that the CE marking was going to disappear, and that the CE marking was originally due to disappear in circa 2022. It was then extended to January 2023. It then went to December of this year, December 24. And I had a little look this morning, and it actually says that for construction products, CE marking will disappear on the 30th of June 2025. So we are almost 4 years after the fact for the potential abolition of CE marking. And I think around CE marking, I think we obviously we forget really why CE marking was invented or created, and fundamentally it was created to create an open market of trade really within the European Union, and wider than that. And I think with the replacement of CE marking to UKCA, which will be the UK CE marking equivalent, the beauty of that, and there's not many things actually about leaving the European Union I was particularly keen on, but I think the beauty of that is actually we do become very much at the centre of our own destiny around scrutiny and conformity of products, which I think will be a really positive thing. So I think that the capacity issue is broad. I think there is, beyond the capacity issues we talked about, the capacity of competence is also problematic. And I think the issue around the way that testing has happened is that we were driven by European standardisation fundamentally for the ability to sell product freely within the European Union. And I think to some extent, and Moral Day report said it, that there was a real hollowing out of expertise within the United Kingdom. And I think part of the criticism, and that loops back into Dame Judith Hackett's report as well, is that we are in a position where there was an over-reliance on the ability of the standards that you were testing to demonstrate a product actually does the job that you want it to do. And I think the hollowing out of expertise, which is the language again that Moral Day report utilised, was more around the fact that there isn't the ability necessarily, and I don't say that about the people that are in that position, because obviously there are a great deal of very talented people in the market in the UK, but the observation really was that without a great deal of technical knowledge and ability and the ability to exact judgment over the appropriateness of the standards for the testing that you were doing, despite the product meeting a test, actually, was it fit for purpose or not? Well, actually, the testing wasn't quite right, and the expertise that was overseeing it didn't see the dangers that were hidden within the sort of testing it was doing. And I think the last point really that I'd make is that product innovation is something that the construction industry in particular is all for. The construction industry is a wonderful place to work in, and having worked at tier ones who are very much around sustainability and really intrigued in how mass timber can be used and cross-laminated timber can be utilised in the construction market. What you actually find is that innovation is starting to outstrip the pace at which standards can keep up around the testing of those products. And I think, again, with a lack of competency and expertise, we do run the risk of saying, well, this product does meet that particular test, but because it's such an innovative product, there are other aspects of that product that needs to be tested to identify whether it's safe or it isn't. And I think part of that is comes into why we were where we are with Grenfell Tower, because of the lack of the ability of standardisation to catch up with the innovation of the products that actually we saw burn on that tragic night.
It's really interesting. Sorry, George, just to pick up on a couple of points and elaborate a little bit. When we talk about capacity, it isn't just look at the capacity of this, it's the need to do work, to do testing work, to satisfy the regulations. And actually, as we tighten the regulations up and people then start properly asking questions, has that been tested or how is that approved, rather than just accepting somebody's word for it, then the capacity issue really comes into play, because people will need to prove the compliance of their products and systems more than they did in the past. And that's the right thing to do, because we have seen in a number of cases people have had their products included in buildings without proper compliance being checked. And when we check the compliance, as we will do on an ongoing basis now in the correct way, a better way, then there'll be a bigger need for that capacity. And add that to Brexit, where we had access to all of the European test labs, and now we don't. We've only got the UK ones. You know, that there's a number of factors here. And then if people stop accepting assessments, technical assessments that we just spoke about, then there's even more need to test. Even if the thing's very close to what was already tested, they'll need to do another test there. So the capacity isn't just this or one aspect of it. Everything's interlinked here with the need to be better at what we do in construction, every aspect of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting, Chris, the point you make is absolutely right, that the drive for assurance at a very senior level, fundamentally board level of a lot of tier one contractors who are designing and developing, you know, the real innovative, iconic projects that the UK are currently delivering, they're very much moving away from trusting the judgment of expertise in and around extending field of application, and they are very much in the world of saying, well, look, it makes more sense for us to spend some money and actually test what we are about to install on our project, which fundamentally was the drive for our relationship with the FPA around having our own test facility, because the drive for not necessarily during design, but actually where historically you would solve problems at stage 5, and you know, there's a lot of people that talk about stage 5 design, which isn't quite true. You know, it's just that sometimes you have to do a construction workaround. You know, in some circumstances, that construction workaround isn't necessarily something you're going to be able to use a tested solution for, particularly in passive fire protection. So actually, the drive now is less about getting a technical assessment and proceeding on that basis, and actually stopping the job and going and testing it. And I think with the Building Safety Act and the gateways in particular, that kind of notifiable change where a builder's work opening changes dimensions or the services going through it aren't quite in the configuration that was originally designed, and actually the fire stopping solution you suggested at stage 4 won't necessarily fit, becomes a notifiable change to the regulator. So actually getting it right is going to be far more pronounced for the critical path of the design and construction of the project. So it's very, very difficult, but you're absolutely right. There are more people needing to test things than ever before. And when you bring in the issues around the CE marking, there are an awful lot of people who didn't think they'd have to do any testing at all, who will now have to go and retest and reassess their products to get a UKCA marking. And as a result, we're in a situation, it's almost like the perfect storm for testing capacity problems. We've got some standardisation change, which requires everyone to retest stuff. We lose BS476 and expect an EN test, and that there's more testing expectation there in certain products. And then you've got the construction industry that are demanding tested solutions rather than extended field of application or test assessments. Then capacity goes through the roof.